Okay, welcome everybody. We will start here right on time so that we get the biggest amount of time for our presenters. Each presenter has 20 minutes or so to present, and then that allows us about 10 minutes of discussion. And it's just, as I said, the two presentations today. Our first presenter is Dr. Jamie Brunsdon from the University of Memphis in Tennessee, the US. The title of his presentation is Flourishing Through the Spectrum Toward an Affective-Oriented Composite Pedagogical Model, ? With that, I'll let you start, Jamie.
Thank you, Mark. I'll just share my screen. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Okay, well, greetings, everyone. Thank you for being here and for listening to my presentation entitled Flourishing Through the Spectrum Toward an Affective-Oriented Composite Pedagogical Model. A special thanks to the Spectrum Institute for Teaching and Learning and the board members of the Institute for inviting me to present today. Much of what I'm about to describe was supported by funds received from the Spectrum Institute, for which I'm grateful for. For those who don't know me, my name is Jamie Brunsdon. I'm a second-year assistant professor of physical education, teacher education at the University of Memphis. This presentation has three parts. First, I'll provide some background knowledge related to spectrum theory, models-based practice, and human flourishing, with the aim of justifying the need for creating a composite pedagogical model. I will then outline a composite pedagogical model guided by two independent theories. Thereafter, I will summarize how I've attempted to realistically study the model. My hope in sharing this in-progress example is to show that this isn't just a thought experiment, but something which has become a tangible reality, could potentially help to bring forth the power of the spectrum and provide colleagues with a means to develop the field further. Due to time constraints, I should also stress that I'll be providing a condensed review of these concepts and welcome future conversations and debates. Since its creation in the 1960s, the spectrum of teaching and learning has served as a significant conceptual framework for the field of physical education and has since provided a foundational language for pedagogues to understand, communicate about, and structure the act of teaching and learning in coordinated ways. And while the theory and conceptual framework has developed over time, the central premise for the framework has remained the same, that teaching is a chain of decision-making. Despite this, over the last decade, several leading thinkers and spectrum scholars, many of whom have joined us for today's presentation, have presented a series of future considerations for the field to appraise should the field want to advance research related to spectrum theory. While there are, of course, multiple considerations to pay attention to, of particular importance to this presentation and subsequently the work behind it is related to studying the kinship between the spectrum and the concept of models-based practice more closely. Moreover, I should probably highlight that I, like many other colleagues in the field, do not recognize the spectrum as a pedagogical model. While I'm unable to address this point at length, I should state that outside of its advanced description of teacher episodes, I think it falls short of some components that many other models possess, and thus doesn't meet Casey and Kirk's conceptual definition. Of course, I could be wrong, and there are certainly in-depth discussions to be had, but that's how I interpret this ideal at this time. So given this situation, and that the spectrum was once considered as the most significant advancement in the theory of pedagogy, and that all over the world, models-based practice has become a leading trend for practitioners and researchers alike, I'm almost certain that Byra and Hewitt et al. Are correct in saying that we've only just touched the tip of the iceberg in terms of possible spectrum research. But you might be asking, well, what role can the spectrum play within models-based practice outside of how we already understand it? And how might these concepts, be they unified or separated, impact the flourishing of youth, which, as many of you are aware of, is becoming an increasingly important objective across all educational circles. With that said, however, much more attention is being paid to the first question and not enough has been given to the second one. We need only look back at the presentations from last year to see that much well-needed discussion and debate is needed surrounding the spectrum and models-based practice. So what has models-based practice got to do with this? For many, models-based practice serves as a possible future for physical education, as it appears to have provided educationalists with the means, lens, and tools with which to start to transform the discipline into a more equitable, meaningful, and considerable space. Of course, there are some critiques linked to this statement, but I believe it's a fair point to make. With that in mind, and irrespective of the volumes of research previously conducted on pedagogical models, it would appear that the best and most significant tool for teaching youth is linked to our ability to create new pedagogical models with modern perspectives and practices, and to experiment with existing pedagogical models in modern ways as and when it is appropriate to do so. And that this is especially important when working with children experiencing precarity. So you might be thinking, you've talked about the spectrum and then models-based practice, but what's human flourishing got to do with any of this? Well, as many of you are aware, the concept of human flourishing, which, for example, refers to one's ability to live a subjectively meaningful and objectively valuable life, and to actualize and refine their human faculties to the best of their ability, is becoming an increasingly hot topic in educational circles, and is, in some way, being viewed as the overarching aim of education. So much so that multinational institutions such as UNESCO or UNICEF, among others, are positioning it as its ultimate goal of education. But what would Mostyn say about this? In my interpretation, this is what he was getting at when he was talking about the idea of a free man, specifically Mostyn voiced. It is a free man whose unique individuality is sought and developed. It is a free man whom a free society wishes to produce through its education. Education for a society of independent people. Independence means that one can learn to be free, free of physical limitations, oppressive social forces, emotional prisons, and intellectual dogmatism. The education for a free, independent person must be a freeing process, a process so deliberately and elegantly developed that the student's dependency on the teacher gradually diminishes until the free student emerges. Given this reality then, it would appear that an intentional emphasis on the effective domain and subsequently pedagogies of effect could provide a basis for youth to challenge their sense of precarity and provide youth with opportunities that insist of a possibility of a good life and in a sense that all might flourish. A good life, in this way, does not ignore the physical and physiological components of flourishing, rather, it recognizes and enhances it. Despite this view, we appear to be in a bit of a predicament as a field. This predicament, which is captured nicely by Casey and Fernandez Rio, recognizes that as a discipline, we have a general lack of understanding about what effective learning is and does and how to best teach it. But this is not a new phenomenon. We've known this for a long time, and we've known that the effective domain in physical education has been a conceptual and technical nightmare. And while there has, of course, been incredible research complementing this topic, specifically as it relates to Hellison's pedagogical model, Sport for Peace, among other initiatives, to date, there remains more psychomotor-oriented models, naturally, compared to models favoring alternative domains of learning. As a consequence, then, there is certainly a justification for the idea about creating new pedagogical models and reshaping existing and already established models in new ways and with the aim of serving modern youth. Given that there appears to be a shift in broader educational circles toward human flourishing and its overarching aim, there is also a need for the field of physical education to establish at least one, but ideally multiple, models concentrated on human flourishing. Finally, given all the positive work associated with the spectrum over the last 60 years, I'm almost certain that the spectrum can play an important and positive role within our thinking and how we go about framing emerging approaches. Part 2. The purpose of this project, broadly, was to create and field test an affective-oriented composite pedagogical model drawing from two independent theories. One, which is distinctly pedagogical, and the other, which is distinctly ethical. I use the term composite pedagogical model instead of pedagogical model as I am merging two distinct theories with two distinct characteristics. To help guide model construction, I employed Casey and Kirk's definition of what defines a pedagogical model. In summary, the main parts include A, a main idea or purpose of the model, B, critical elements, aka distinctive features of the model, C, intended learning aspirations or things that are intended to be learned by the end of the model. And D, pedagogy, the alignment between teaching, learning, curriculum, and assessment. So let's break down these theories very briefly. Spectrum theory is a decision-making based conceptual framework meant to describe the anatomy of teaching and learning. Its ultimate objective can be interpreted as achieving an elevated level of consciousness and deliberation within and through the developmental channels. Moreover, the spectrum maintains the view that teaching styles can and do vary and contribute to the creation of specific teaching and learning conditions that are unique in nature and are distinct from alternative styles of teaching. Furthermore, the anatomy of a style is broken down into pre-impact, impact, and post-impact. And of course, it's more complicated than that, but I'm preaching to the choir here, so I'm being brief on purpose. So neo-Aristotelian virtue ethics. This is a philosophy that comes from Aristotle, and the term neo refers to a modern interpretation of the classical philosophy. At the heart of virtue ethics, as shown in the picture, are three broad components. First, eudaimonia. Second, phronesis. Third, virtue and character. Beginning with eudaimonia, which is otherwise known as well-being, human flourishing, or happiness, for example, refers to one's ability to achieve their human potential. It focuses on living an optimally moral life that is an objectively valuable and subjectively meaningful. It's a position that prioritizes balance in one life and is believed to range from misery or floundering to lack of flourishing to blessedness. In this way, individual flourishing is inherently connected to societal flourishing and is again the ultimate aim of a virtue ethicist. But how does one achieve such a position in life, do you ask? According to a virtue ethicist, this begins with developing a good sense of character. That is, eudaimonic-oriented character traits, dispositions, and tendencies that are stable across situations. Viewed in this way, a person should attempt to cultivate moral, performance, civic, and intellectual virtues, which are, in other words, different types of virtues influencing one's identity. Of course, I'm aware of the critiques associated with character education and physical education, and I encourage you to look at my prior works where I have attempted to address this topic. Finally, having developed a virtuous foundation, a person would be in a good position to develop a good sense of phronesis or practical wisdom. This, in summary, is a meta-virtue and is an intellectual bridge influencing one's knowledge of the good, motivation for doing good, and ability and action when doing the good. It is the cognitive element influencing a person's ability to use the right virtue at the right degree and at the right time, and is a feature connecting one's character formation to eudaimonia. Again, there's much more to this topic, but I hope at this stage you get the general idea of the philosophy. So let's look at this together then and form the theories into one composite pedagogical model through the lens of a main idea, critical elements, intended learning aspirations, and pedagogy. So here we go. I give you the first look at what I call the spectrum model, and I'll give you a couple of seconds to digest that. So let's take a look at the following table. As you'll notice, there are two main ideas or purposes. There are three critical elements or defining features. And there are 6 intended learning aspirations, all ranging from the most to least important, top to bottom. So at the heart of the proposed model are 2 purposes. The first is distinctly Aristotelian and advocates for teachers centralizing all teaching and learning aspirations and interactions through the lens of human flourishing, and with the aim of helping youth to pursue an objectively valuable and subjectively meaningful life through the content and focus. The second main idea in phronesis in this circumstance, however, is not isolated to the tenets of one framework, but rather it was used to bridge the gap between the cognitive developmental focus associated with both theories. Specifically, I use Aristotle's boundless term of phronesis instead of one set forth by Mostyn and Ashworth, as I believe it captures and is synonymous with their original emphasis for teaching an elevated level of consciousness and deliberation through the spectrum and across the developmental channels. The 3 distinctive features influencing teachers' ability to promote student phronesis and flourishing are illustrated on the screen. The first and most important of these in decision-making is shared between teachers and pupils across the landmark styles, replicates Mostyn and Ashworth's view that teaching is a chain of decision-making. While there may be raised eyebrows at my use of the concept being used as a critical element as opposed to a main idea, I recognize this to be more influential for understanding how youth can be taught and not the primary reason or rationale for employing the model. The second critical element in flourishing friendships recognizes the importance of friendship in one's pursuit of phronesis and eudaimonia. In this way, a teacher ought to consider how their subject inherently creates or inhibits opportunities for moral friendships emerging, how their classroom culture in the form of policies, rules, expectations, pedagogies, assessments, etc., have previously and/or are currently helping you to explore this concept in authentic ways. Of course, the idea is not for children to have found their flourishing friend or to have created a truly flourishing friendship by the end of the unit. Rather, it is for you to have an improved understanding of what it means to be a good friend, the kind of friend they want to be, and to have a clearer understanding of how their virtuous or vicious action is linked to its creation, maintenance, or destruction. The third, in virtue and character, is distinctly Aristotelian and advocates for intentional teaching of moral, civic performance, intellectual virtues into one's character. In this way, teachers employing the model should attempt to prioritize transformative and progressive practices or productive learning, foregrounding a balanced virtuous education, as opposed to mimetic practices or reproductive learning focused on a set of one virtues predominantly. Consequently, the teacher's ability to cultivate virtue and character and flourishing friendships through the curriculum being taught and by sharing decision-making across the landmark styles is likely to facilitate the kinds of education espoused by the spectrum and virtue ethics. Perhaps the most complicated part of the model to break down is its learning aspirations, but the general idea is based on the tenets of both theories. So where appropriate, teachers should shift to using more productive styles and learners should shift toward becoming more productive learners. Learners should seek to have an improved character and phronetic identity, as well as their ability to create and maintain flourishing friendships. The most significant of all, however, are the following. First, and drawing from Motton and Ashworth, persons become to honor, with reliability, a range of educational ideas and human abilities across the developmental channels. Second, drawing from Aristotle, persons have developed a more sophisticated sense of and commitment to their moral purpose in life. But what about suggested pedagogies? This is the least refined component of the proposed model for obvious reasons, and because I believe that someone employing the model ought to find unique ways for them to use it based on the context in which they find themselves. That said, I would argue that perhaps someone's pedagogies could be framed around the following. First, the definitions, anatomies, and structures of landmark styles should form the inspiration for the type of teaching that is to take place. Second, the pedagogical unit ought to have an additional component in moral focus to ensure that affective content, teaching and learning is combined with the content being taught. And third, that the teaching for and about friendship ought to be prioritized through the content. There's much more to say about this, but I'll save this for future discussions. And that concludes my review of the model before moving on to part 3. The purpose of the investigation was to study how one Peat faculty member employed the model within one K-12 setting. The research questions guiding the study were, what organizational structure, methods, and content did the faculty member use to employ the spectrum model? And what barriers and facilitators acted to influence the faculty member's ability to employ the spectrum model? To complete the case study, one Peat faculty member located at a flagship institution was personally invited to participate in the teaching experiment. At the time of data collection, Leo, identified as white, male, was able-bodied, aged between 30 and 40 years of age, and was purposely invited to participate because of the reasons presented on the screen. The setting was one K-12 school located in the Deep South. It was home to 3 full-time teaching-oriented physical education teachers that had no coaching responsibility. It was home to 800 students between the ages of 5 and 18. It was diverse in nature. At the elementary and secondary level, students received 2 60-minute lessons and 3 75-minute lessons, respectively. The program culture was described as rigorous, models-based, and educationally rich. To complete the project, Leo was given the spectrum framework and instructed to teach the model to one elementary, middle, and high school class within the K-12 school. Consequently, Leo taught 28 lessons in total, including 8 lessons at the elementary class and 10 lessons within the secondary classes. Data were collected with 8 techniques. These included Leo being interviewed once, being observed teaching on all occasions, and the researcher taking copious field notes based on the contents of the lesson. This also included Leo supplying film of his teaching, completing several critical incident reports based on their teaching, as well as keeping a journal. The systematic observation instrument of IFITS, aka the instrument for identifying teaching styles, we use to code and categorize the data. To analyze and interpret the data, however, the researchers will employ a 5-step thematic analysis. Generally, this will include organizing the data into the guiding research questions, coding the data, grouping the data into initial categories, and then reducing these into more focused themes, and then selecting data to report in the manuscript. To analyze positivistic data, guided by IFITS, we will search for percentages of intervals for each individual teaching style used and identify descriptive statistics based on the teaching styles used or not across all lessons. Furthermore, if necessary, we will complete an independent t-test and use a Dunn-Bonferroni method to control for type 1 errors. Intra and inter reliability techniques will be used to ensure data credibility. And the findings, well, hopefully that comes to a journal near you. That is, if an editor and reviewer of a journal believes that this is good enough work. To that end, I thank you for your time, and I thank the Spectrum Institute and would welcome your observations, comments, and questions.
Thank you, Jamie.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. Questions for Jamie?
It was a lot, I know.
I'll jump in, Mark, if that's okay.
Go ahead, Kelly.
Hey, Jamie, thank you for the presentation. Really great work. And I've read a little bit of your other work on this idea, and I'll be honest, I don't know if I understand it completely. So I'm trying to learn as you're presenting it. You did a great job, but I'm wondering, how are the styles being used to capture these ethical and moral type of instructional pieces? Could you talk a little bit more about the relationship between the actual strategies and some of these goals that you've laid out, just to give me a better picture of it? Great job.
Thank you. So obviously I don't have a complete answer for you, but I can give you my interpretation of what I think about that. So I think obviously all the styles have a unique fundamental definition which promotes a particular teaching behavior and a learning behavior. So the way in which it was framed, or at least I interpreted it, it was my view that each individual style, or the definition of the style, should inform the environment being created and thus influence the kinds of teaching that occurs. I guess if I was to share my screen again and to go back to this, can you see my page?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. My view is that obviously teaching is a chain of decision making, and based on the learners in front of us, the teacher will plan and make these decisions and will consider which style, whether it's practice or inclusion, is the most appropriate for the type of learning the teacher wants to promote. Consequently, the style itself is linked to a particular form of character formation, be that civic, intellectual, performance, or moral, and the teacher plans that, which in turn is hopefully linked to promoting practical wisdom and human flourishing. And of course, within this final area are all the developmental channels. So a long-winded point is, I think the styles themselves can be used. The teacher knows that, okay, I want my students to become more independent. I use one of the discovery styles. And depending on the support the teacher wants to provide, that can be used to promote a particular kind of character or other aspects. So.
Great, thank you, I appreciate it.
Another question?
Mark, can I make a comment?
Nikos, go ahead.
Yeah, Jamie, very interesting presentation, I would say. I wasn't sure what to hear before this presentation, but now I understand more. I need to perhaps explain something. I mean, the ultimate goal of education for Aristoteles was happiness. But the Greek word for happiness is, I don't know if you know that, it's ευτυχία. It means that you focus on developing, just to put it very simply, happiness doesn't come without the development of certain virtues. It doesn't happen by luck. So it's an interesting idea to use the spectrum in order to link the spectrum of teaching styles with possible affective outcomes, if I'm correct. And I'm pretty sure that many of us will be curious to hear what you have done with this work. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for that. Obviously, my thought when hearing that is, obviously, character and virtue needs to be taught intentionally. It's, we've held this assumption in the profession that character development is automatic, and actually it's more problematic than automatic, especially, if we're working with teachers and coaches that have unrefined levels of pedagogy, that they might be in some ways promoting vices. So obviously I absolutely agree. I think we need to be really intentional about teaching character and virtue, but I'm also very aware that we can teach character and virtue both directly and indirectly, which I think is what the spectrum can contribute to. It can help maybe provide a lens for teachers to approach different kinds of teaching in different ways, depending on the students in front of us. I think with elementary children, we do need to be more direct, whereas with older students, we can play in the gray a little bit more and talk about variants of virtue and character development, and when it's being too honest or too patient, so on and so forth. So.
Kane has her hand raised.
Hi, thank you, Jamie. So that was a great presentation. I have a quick question. So I think it's like what you're talking about is, again, I don't know very well, but this is my first time listening. I think it's influenced by what's going on in our society or their society they're living in, or community, right? How do you include that aspect into your idea here? So for example, do you understand what I'm saying? I think it's like, so there's a student there and there's a diverse learners there, they are coming from different backgrounds and the culturals, and then again, their happiness of flourishing, the word you're using, is also very much influenced by the society or community or the world that the students are living in. So how do you put that into the consideration of what you're doing there? Does that make sense?
Thank you. No, it's a really important point. So flourishing, one of the reasons why flourishing is becoming it's getting a lot of popularity in educational circles and people are viewing it as an overarching aim of education, is because human flourishing is a universal concept, which regardless of the different communities, cultures, even though it originated in kind of Western culture, human flourishing is a concept which we can all relate to. We can all relate to achieving one's potential in human life. And obviously different cultures will have different ideas about what that is and what that means and how to go about that. But human flourishing is something which creates connections as opposed to breaks connections. So it brings people together. And that's how I've interpreted it in regardless of cultures, and even in Eastern philosophies, I'm aware that, even though we use the different terms, we're aiming for the same thing. So I think, and the term human flourishing is a term which I think people can connect with compared to eudaimonia, or, so that's my response to that. I think it's a concept which brings people together, which is a positive when working in diverse schools and diverse cultures.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jamie. I will keep us on time here. Great presentation. I think a lot of future thought involved here, and it'd be really neat to see your data with your next part. I'm really looking forward to that. But we need to move on. And so thank you very much, Jamie. Great presentation.
Thank you.
Our second presenters today are Dr. Brendan SueSee, Senior Lecturer from University of Southern Queensland, and Dr. Shane Pill, Associate Professor at Flinders University in Australia. Their presentation today is titled, How the Spectrum Teaching Styles Can Help Models-Based Practice Fly Further, highlighting the complexities of models. Brennan?
Thank you very much, Jamie, for your presentation. Thank you very much, Mark, for introduction as well. I'll just share my screen. Is that good?
Yeah.
Yeah. All righty. I'm presenting on behalf, obviously, of myself and Shane Pill today, who's from Flinders University. He couldn't join us. He had another commitment. So as Mark said, we're going to look at how the spectrum, we think, if you use it as a lens, can help models-based practice fly further. Shane and I would like to acknowledge traditional owners of the lands on which we speak to you from today and acknowledge their leaders past, present and emerging. So what is going to happen today? I'm going to try and answer Casey and Kirk's question, are models-based practices great white elephants or great white hopes? And we're also going to try and answer a question, to what extent can the spectrum offer an opportunity to close the gap, or as Casey and Kirk termed it, between the hope and the happening? And we're going to use cooperative learning as one model to, I guess, probably have a look at through the lens of the spectrum in terms of doing it. We certainly are not picking on cooperative learning or any model mentioned by Metzler. Of course, being a spectrum nerd, I will employ a non-versus approach. I have no bias against any model or teaching style. So models-based practice kind of emerged when Kirk said that for phys ed to have any kind of educative relevance, the sport as technique, multi-activity form, one size fits all, that needed to be replaced or challenged. And models-based practice kind of emerged or was pushed to the forefront or was argued to the forefront as a possible solution to that. I often think it's funny as we go along, if we could talk to Mostyn, he would have sat there, or sit there looking at this situation and go, come on guys, let's move it along. I identified this as a problem many years ago. What are you guys doing? Have you moved it along or what? So really briefly, and there's a little bit of overlap here with Jamie's presentation in terms of speaking about models. So Casey and Kirk, I'll refer to as well, speak about models-based practice as an organising centre for content, teaching, etc. They like to say it's not one model. Frequently it's spoken about as a model. And models-based practices only applies, they say, when you're considering a multi-model approach to PE. And of course, the models they speak of, and quite often others, are largely based on Metzler's seminal work, the instructional models. Casey and Kirk actually wrote a book on models-based practice. I think it was last year or the year before. It's pretty good. I haven't worked all the way through it, but some really good information in there. So Metzler's models, just briefly in that instructional models book, there are 8. He never, to my knowledge, says it's a definitive list. And of course, in the last few years, in some parts of the world, health promoting PE has been spoken about or written about as a model as well. So, great white elephants spinning their wheels. Where was model-based practice going? So we're kind of basing this presentation a lot on Casey and Kirk's work, in particular, these 2 articles in 2014 and 2020, I think it was, sharing their concerns or their questioning. So some authors have found, for example, in Australia, models-based practice has not really taken hold due to a common or a mandated curriculum. So in Australia, just to give it a context, we have a government that tells us what to teach. It doesn't tell us how to teach, but there is a curriculum or a syllabus, as we also say, same dog, different name, which we're told to teach. So when we probably try and look at it at times, there's parts, if you're doing sport ed, where we'd think, when would I be doing the report on this week's activities? That doesn't fit in our curriculum. So some have argued that that's a bit of a drama or challenge. Some have also said that because it is sometimes viewed as both a curriculum model as well as a pedagogical model, that also adds to confusion or creates a bit of a blockage or a challenge. And then again, even within those who write about models-based practice, there's confusion as to what they are exactly, with some describing them as curriculum models and others describing it as a PED model. So Confusion, as always, again, similar thing that Mostyn spoke about, confusion of terminology, common terminology would help. A few other things that have popped up along the way. Casey questioned, did they fail or were they spinning their wheels or were there challenges with them because teachers were unable or unwilling to implement as the creator intended, and this resulted in a watering down, and others have identified that as well. Two authors from Australia, Shane Pill, who's part of this presentation, just not here, and Stephen Stoltz, they kind of actually said they think that's inevitable because teachers are theory appliers who have to implement the model as best they can in the classroom. And we've often spoken about, Shane Pill and myself going, we're pretty sure you wouldn't be getting anywhere, as an example, if you were doing a game-based approach. And you might be saying to a kid, you know, if a kid came to you and said, oh, sir, I've been hit in the face 3 times. If you said, mate, you'll eventually discover how to do it, we'll just push through. So of course, teachers have to adapt to suit the learner. Again, as we said, whether you have common or prescribed curriculum frameworks, constraints are applied on the teachers in terms of what they teach. There's only a certain amount to teach and there's a certain time to get through it. And I guess they sometimes feel if you're working in those environments, I can't go like off task and do these other things. And Kurtner Smith mentioned that quite often, I think they were writing from England there, but I'm not sure, that quite often teachers, they might want to do it or they might feel it's the right thing to do, but it just doesn't fit with the school program. So as we said, is it a PED model when they're talking about sometimes models-based practice, or is it a curriculum model, or is it both? And some have said that there's no clear agreement about what it is. And even in Australia, as an example, again, Rick Baldock, Shane Pill identified 7 different names for game-based or game-centered approaches. So again, I'm sure Boston will just be sitting there going, yep, I've seen this story before, guys. It's pretty common. A common language would help us describe these things. So we wondered, can the spectrum help close this gap, this hope in the happening that Casey and Kirk asked about? And as I said, of course, we're providing this from a non-versus approach when we look at it. And we also think a non-versus approach and perspective would help teachers see models-based practices differently as well. We think that the spectrum would help teachers see the micro-pedagogies used that actually make up models-based practice. And we also think it would help them see that, or give them a lens to see that models-based practices are not a style, but they're actually a cluster of styles being used to implement. So as usual, bit of Spectrum 101, no teaching style is inherently good or bad. They perhaps should only be judged for their ability to meet an objective or an outcome. And of course, no individual style could meet every need. So how could just one way do it? And as I said, a non-versus approach, and there's no point in doing that. So we're going to use cooperative learning, and this has taken this information from Metzler's book. So I must admit I was a bit confused. I sometimes say, and I mean this with all respect, I joke that I've been poisoned by the spectrum in that it's provided me with a lens to view pedagogy. And yes, I admit my, if you want to say bias, that I always think I see it being influenced by the spectrum. So Metzler in his book says cooperative learning is not really a model by itself, which I thought that's pretty interesting that someone wrote a book where they dedicated a whole chapter to a model, which is apparently not a model on its own. Then goes on to say that it's a set of teaching strategies. So obviously we agree with him on that concept, but the most important being the grouping of students, etc., which immediately struck me as, gee, that's a little bit different or less specific to teaching as a chain of decision making. In particular, when speaking about groupings or task presentations as well in our cooperative learning, says there are no task presentations by the teacher in cooperative learning. Teacher frames the problem, sets the rules, it's expected. Students use peer teaching as the main mode. So when we look at that through a spectrum lens, pre-impact, teacher selects or frames the problem and how they'll be assessed. The students attempt to solve the problem through peer teaching as suggested, and the teacher post-impact will assess by is the problem solved potentially or maybe some other criteria. So Metzler says maybe using jigsaw is a way to do that. Students are assigned a part of the skill, teachers part they learn to the other student. Now, he doesn't actually say how that would be done, but I'm guessing, let's say it's a modern day student, they might jump on YouTube or maybe a resource provided the teacher, you know, how do I hit a forehand in tennis? We would suggest this would mostly be practice style B. If you're looking at something like YouTube or a set of instructions, you're essentially replacing the person or the teacher with a book or a video. And unless specified, there's very little difference in terms of the decision-making being made by the learner. They will probably attempt to replicate or reproduce the knowledge or the model or the movement provided by the teacher or the clip. However, if the teacher presented the task as more of a problem and the students used questioning, trial and error, more than one cognitive step to try and discover what was going on, we would suggest this could be a production cluster style, such as convergent discovery, as the student's producing one way to hit the forehand. We then say if student 1 was teaching it to student 2, as the jigsaw strategy suggests, they're probably going to use practice style B to do this unless specified. Another way, again, going back to teaching, is a chain of deliberate decision making. Metzler also speaks about using questioning. So things such as, what's the specific problem your group's having? Why do you think you're having this problem? Can you give me 3 possible options? We suggest this questioning could represent, at the least, guided discovery or practice style for the following reasons. So guided discovery, as defined by Mostyn and Ashworth, logical sequential design of questions. This means that when the teacher asks a specific set of questions, student is led to discover the process. However, again, it gets a bit messy, could be practice style, as Mostyn and Ashworth again saying random questions, review questions, etc. Quite often leading more towards practice style, and merely asking questions does not imply the use of guided discovery. So these review questions in this episode could either be guided discovery or a bit of practice style. So we would suggest that, just looking at those brief examples, and again, time's always working against us, the spectrum allows us to identify at least 3 styles in this little episode. And again, to argue it's a cluster of styles and not a style or episodes of teaching, or it helps you see the episodic nature of the learning experience. So we think that, again, to go along with Casey and Kirk on this, they suggested that there needs to be a move for models-based practice beyond this for or against debate of a model. And we think if you do have this for or against or this versus debate, we suggested that it ends up in 5 types of failure, which I know one type of failure is usually bad enough, let alone 5. But 1, you fail to implement the model in the textbook form as the teacher, but you meet the student's needs. So if you view it as just I'm either doing the model or I'm not, I guess you're either doing it or you're not. The second kind of failure is you implemented the model, but you failed the student. So you can pat yourself on the back and say, good work, Brendan. I did that. Metzler would be proud of me, or Siedentop would be proud of me, but my kids are not very happy because I didn't actually adapt it to suit their needs at the time. We think there's a third type of failure in that, I guess, we as physical education, teacher educators, we've failed to move or shift thinking about how we view models. And the 2 last types of failure, the 4th and 5th, is you just revert back. So people like us, we teach perhaps at universities, we encourage students to try and use different models to meet outcomes, and all that fails. And then it just reverts back to perhaps the classic sporters technique, or just doing things the way they've always been done, as others have spoken about. Now, again, a bit unfortunate here, Pill and Stoltz, to build on that point I made earlier, saying that they weren't surprised because teachers are theory appliers. They're not necessarily theory generators. They're just trying to do the job. So they're pragmatic and they just try to make the model work in their context. But again, we argue saying with Casey and Kirk, this all or nothing perspective or a versus perspective needs to be moved away of in terms of a for or against discussion, if anyone's having that still with models-based practice. And having a versus approach means that there is this fixed way of doing a model and there's little acceptance of maneuvering. This is, again, I know we're all probably, as they say, singing from the same songbook, but the concept in the spectrum of there's the landmark approach, or if you want to call it the textbook approach, but there's canopy approaches, and they have pluses and minuses, but there's this acceptance a little bit of, well, I might have to take a few things out of reciprocal style, or I might need to help students a little bit more than the landmark version that's presented in the book if I'm going to help students do it. So how can the spectrum help here? We're saying it helps because it sees models-based practices as a cluster of teaching styles or a series of episodes, and that when there might be some modification, you're not watering it down if it's a deliberate decision to meet the learning needs of the student and support them in the outcome. If you view it in this way, the model does not become constrained by its inherent features, the non-negotiables or things such as that. And you start to view it as saying, I am creating learning experiences to meet a wide variety of objectives. And again, Casey and Kirk, building on their work, they actually said in their book, pedagogical models are specifications for practice and program development. They're not programs on their own to be strictly aligned to. Further to this, so when it's seen as a cluster of styles, while there still might be a dominant teaching style used, it acknowledges that there may be other ones. And as we've said, from the spectrum, no one style can do anything. The thing that I think is ironic here is from the research of people like Kurtner Smith, Hasty, Kalina and Cothran, they've already shown that there's a dominant style usually used or self-identified and then used. Mitch Hewitt in Australia with coaching. So we know that there's a dominant style whether you're using models-based practice or not. So I don't think that's necessarily such a big deal or anything mind-blowing. And we think that if people knew the spectrum, it would provide the skills and knowledge to let teachers see the micro-pedagogy or the instructional strategies to enable the explanation of the utility of a teaching episode that make up PE lessons. And the spectrum helps teachers see this and understand this complexity and gives them tools and a toolbox to bridge this distance between the hope and the happening. So as an example, if we go back to cooperative learning or something like that, if we sit there as a teacher and say, I want students to discover X, then when you know the spectrum, you sit there and go, well, if they're really going to discover, then I'm probably going to use a discovery episode. Terms such as groupings does not inherently allow someone to discover anything, and it's not a style. And grouping is common to many teaching styles or episodes. So to say that that's the best way to describe cooperative learning in one way, there's more to it than that as well. And as we said in our presentation, there were at least 3 styles which we would identify. Further research we would like to see is obviously, does the spectrum allow teachers to implement models-based practice better or more successfully? We think that would be very interesting. And to answer our question, last 2 slides that we originally asked, or Casey and Kirk asked and we attempted to answer, we think models-based practices are, first of all, potentially great white elephants if you operate from a common curriculum or a mandated curriculum. It does make it difficult to know what fits, what doesn't fit, what am I taking out, what am I doing, etc., and argue that the spectrum does help people implement mandated curriculums for quality PE a little bit more successfully. However, they are also great white hopes, in other words, very helpful, I think, where teachers either ignore, don't understand, lack the pedagogical knowledge perhaps to interpret it pragmatically, and do not have mandated curriculum. We think that they are super helpful in those environments, undoubtedly. In saying that, the spectrum still in those situations provides a common language to let them see these things as episodes rather than just a style, such as TGFU is guided discovery. We think that, like we said, spectrum provides the micro-pedagogies and illuminates this happening to show the congruence between the intent of the episode and the actual behaviour of the teacher. And this presentation is based on an article we were lucky enough to get published in Journal of Teaching and Physical Education last year, speaking about it in more detail. And Shane Pill and I also were lucky enough to be invited to have a chat with Risto in his podcast where we spoke about this article as well. So thank you very much for the opportunity to present, and I'll stop my share.
Thank you very much, Brandon. That was great. A lot of neat stuff. a lot of muddle still, but I think in time, if we continue in this direction of trying to look at models-based practice and look at the micro pedagogies, I think it's going to be very, very helpful too in time. But questions? We have about 5 minutes.
Mark, could I start here?
Go ahead, Matt.
Firstly, really enjoyed the presentation, very thought-provoking. I'm old enough to remember when people talked about pedagogical practice way before Casey and Kirk. So the first I can remember was 1986, and it's a book by Jewett, Bain and Ennis. They actually outlined more models than Mike Metzler did, and they linked it to the spectrum as well. So you can certainly go way, way back. So that'd be a first observation. The second one is, I think academics arguing about whether we're going to call things pedagogical models or curricular models is just going to make teachers throw their hands up in the air. For me, they're just synonymous. I also think there's not much models-based practice in schools because there isn't much models-based PEAT either. That's just a thought. The fourth thought I had was, and I think I said this last year when I was presenting, I've always thought of the micro pedagogies in terms of the spectrum and their relationship to models, is that you've got different patterns of teaching style use. So for example, in sport education, you probably start off using more direct styles. And as you shift through a season, you switch to using more indirect styles. But I guess there'll be different patterns that come up if you do the models properly or somewhere close to properly. Some research I did didn't actually find that, but that's the theory of it anyway. Let's see. The last thing I wanted to point out was to sort of defend poor old Mike Metzler, because he's not here to defend himself. And he would make fun of his own rigidity. So he's always, if you read most of what he's written, it always comes across as black and white. It's this or that. I can even remember holding a stopwatch up and coding himself when he was doing a presentation. But if you actually talk to the man, he was not like that at all. When I first met him, I was surprised by how flexible he actually was. So it comes across in his writing that he's very, very sort of dogmatic, and it's this or that. And if you don't do these 5 things and check the boxes, you aren't possibly doing the model. But that was not his intention. He laughed at those kinds of comments and said, well, that's just the way I write. And that wasn't him at all. So just a few reflections.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. As you said, he's not here, and I apologise if I sort of came across in that way. It's certainly not our intention. And I think you're right. Teachers do quite often, we look for this real black or white version of how it's done, whatever it is at times. I wonder if I know I'm making a big general statement about a large group of people, but I wonder if teachers are generally quite conscientious people and we kind of want to do it right. But yeah, so thank you for those comments though as well. It is interesting, again, as I said at the start, for you to say back to 1986, these kind of discussions have been going on, that there must be some people go, geez, you guys move slowly. You're just treading water, aren't you? But hopefully, as you said, Mark, as well, I'd like to think, as we've kind of argued, that the spectrum, it doesn't have to be models-based practice in PE, but helps all pedagogy and teachers know what it is we're talking about. Just this similar goal that Mostyn and Ashworth started out with, of saying we have a common language, we know what we're talking about, we know what you're referring to when you say these things. So, yeah.
Good. Thank you, Brendan. Thank you, Matt. Other questions?
I have comments. Hi.
Today? Go ahead.
Anyway, so that is how I teach spectrum here, within the game-based model, to have student break down the lesson into the small episode, and then I have them identify what spectrum teaching styles they're using in those particular episode within the model-based, different model-based approach teaching. So, me and Kelly has been, I guess, in process of doing the research to get those pre-service teachers' perspective that if you're taught in that way, how do you feel like your readiness to going into the actual teaching? rather than just being taught that like a broad perspective of how to teach big lesson as a model-based approach. And I think, again, we need to analyze the data a little bit more, but as far as I know, my student has found more helpful to like being intentional at each moment of the lesson. So I think that sharing those data, it's gonna help, others to understand like, okay, using the model-based approach, which is, it's increasingly common around the world, but then like breaking down the lesson in a small segment, the episode, and intentionally doing each segment, it's become more effective as a teacher.
Yeah,
So,
Kane, that sounds really, really interesting, and is kind of, I guess, probably answering that question that Shane and I are asking. So, of course, we're presenting this as a theory.
Yeah.
Obviously, we believe in the spectrum going, yeah, I think the spectrum would really help teachers be able to implement models-based practice. And it sounds like you're starting that journey to answer that question. So, one, thanks for your comment. Thanks for doing the work. I'm really glad that it sounds like it's moving in the right direction. But yeah, as I said at the start, I also admit my bias and belief in the spectrum and going, yeah, well, if you know what it is you're trying to achieve, then you will pick a style which matches roughly with that objective or the outcome that you want. So yeah, that's great. I'm really interested to hear what you guys end up doing with that information. It sounds good.
Thanks, Kane. Thanks, Brennan. To stay on time here, we've been here for 1 hour. It was 2 great presentations, really, really nice ones for us to continue to think about the spectrum and how it fits in and so forth. And, I look to our title of our work series this year, Broadening the Spectrum of Teaching Styles Through Global Coalition. It is really not very reflective of that particular title, what we heard here today. I hate to shut things down, but I hope that some of you will contact the authors directly via email or other forum and continue discussions. In closing, thank you very, very much for being a part of today's presentation with the Spectrum Institute of Teaching and Learning. Thanks very much. Have a great weekend, everybody.